In the heart of the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden spires touched the clouds and royal bloodlines had ruled for 1,000 years, a single document would change everything. Hidden beneath layers of silk and locked away in a vault that hadn't been opened in decades, this paper contained a truth so devastating that it would tear apart the very foundations of the monarchy. Queen Isabella Montclair, beloved by her people and respected by neighboring kingdoms, had no idea that her entire reign was built upon a lie. As she prepared for what she believed would be a routine ceremony to officially name her successor, forces beyond her control were already in motion. The kingdom that had known peace for 30 years was about to face its greatest crisis, and the woman who had dedicated her life to serving her people would discover that sometimes the greatest enemies come from within the palace walls. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Queen Isabella Montclair stood before the tall windows of her private study. At 58, she carried herself with the grace that had made her one of the most respected monarchs in Europe. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, and her deep blue eyes reflected the wisdom of someone who had guided a nation through both prosperity and hardship. Today was supposed to be a day of celebration, the formal announcement of her son Prince Alexander as her official heir. After years of careful preparation, the kingdom would finally have certainty about its future. The Queen's personal secretary, Margaret Thornfield, entered the room carrying a stack of documents. Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years, and her loyalty was unquestioned. Her usually calm demeanor seemed slightly strained this morning, though she tried to hide it behind her professional smile. "Your Majesty, the final preparations for today's ceremony are complete," Margaret announced, placing the papers on the ornate wooden desk. "The nobility from all 7 provinces have arrived, and the international delegations are being received in the Blue Room." Queen Isabella turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. "And Prince Alexander? How is he feeling about today?" "He appears ready, Your Majesty. Though I believe he's experiencing some natural nervousness about the responsibility that comes with being officially named heir." Prince Alexander, at 32, had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Unlike many royal children who shirked their duties, he had embraced every aspect of his training. He spoke 4 languages fluently, held degrees in international relations and economics, and had served in the military with distinction. The people of Valdoria genuinely loved him, seeing in him a perfect blend of his mother's wisdom and his late father's strength. As the Queen reviewed the ceremony schedule, a knock came at the door. Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwood entered, his usually composed face showing signs of stress. Blackwood had served the crown for 15 years and was known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering dedication to protocol. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm afraid there's been an unexpected development. We've discovered some historical documents in the royal archives that require immediate attention." The Queen looked up sharply. "What kind of documents, Edmund?" Blackwood glanced nervously at Margaret, then back at the Queen. "Papers dating back to your coronation, Your Majesty. Documents that were apparently misfiled and only recently discovered during routine archive maintenance." "And why do these papers require immediate attention on today of all days?" The Lord Chancellor's pause was telling. "Your Majesty, I believe it would be best if you reviewed them privately. They concern matters of succession and legitimacy." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Queen Isabella had ruled for 30 years without any questions about her right to the throne. Her coronation had been celebrated throughout the kingdom, and her reign had brought unprecedented prosperity and peace. The idea that there could be any documents questioning her legitimacy seemed impossible. "Bring them to me immediately," she commanded, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Blackwood nodded and left the room, returning minutes later with an ancient leather portfolio. The documents inside were yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. As the Queen began to read, her face grew pale. The papers told a story she had never heard before, a story that challenged everything she believed about her own identity. According to the documents, Queen Isabella was not the biological daughter of the previous king, her supposed father King Frederick. Instead, the papers suggested she was the child of a secret affair between the late Queen Mother and a foreign diplomat. More shocking still, the documents indicated that the rightful heir to the throne was actually Duke Marcus Ravencrest, a man who had lived quietly in the northern provinces, completely unaware of his royal bloodline. "This is impossible," the Queen whispered, her hands trembling as she held the papers. "These documents, they must be forgeries." Margaret stepped closer, her face filled with concern. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should have them examined by experts before drawing any conclusions." But Blackwood shook his head grimly. "I've already had our most trusted historians examine them discreetly. The paper, the ink, the seals, everything appears authentic. Moreover, we've found corroborating evidence in other archives, including personal letters written by the late Queen Mother herself." The Queen sank into her chair, the weight of this revelation crushing down upon her. If these documents were real, then her entire reign was illegitimate. Every law she had signed, every decision she had made, every moment of her 30-year rule was based on a lie. Worse still, her beloved son Alexander had no claim to the throne at all. "Duke Marcus Ravencrest," she said slowly, trying to process the information. "I know of him. He's a scholar, isn't he? Lives quietly on his estate, tends to his books and his gardens." "Yes, Your Majesty. He's 55 years old, never married, no children. He's respected in his province but has shown no interest in politics or court life. By all accounts, he has no idea about any of this." The irony was devastating. While Isabella had spent her entire life preparing for and executing the duties of a monarch, the man who was apparently the rightful king had lived in peaceful obscurity, completely unaware of his heritage. "What do we do?" Margaret asked quietly. "The ceremony is set to begin in 3 hours. The entire kingdom is expecting Prince Alexander to be named heir." Queen Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the crown on her head as if for the first time. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. "We cannot proceed with the ceremony as planned. I will not perpetuate a lie, no matter how comfortable that lie has become." "But, Your Majesty," Blackwood protested, "think of the chaos this will cause. The political instability, the international implications. Valdoria has enemies who would love to see us weakened by internal strife." "And what of the moral implications of continuing to rule under false pretenses?" the Queen countered. "What kind of legacy would I leave if I knowingly denied the rightful king his throne?" The room fell silent as the magnitude of the decision settled upon them. This was not just about changing a ceremony or postponing an announcement. This was about potentially ending a dynasty and throwing the kingdom into uncertainty. "There's another consideration," Margaret said hesitantly. "Prince Alexander. How will this affect him? He's devoted his life to preparing for the throne." The Queen's heart ached at the thought of her son. Alexander had never asked to be born into royalty, but he had embraced his destiny with honor and dedication. To tell him that everything he had worked for was meaningless would be devastating. "Alexander must be told immediately," she decided. "He deserves to hear this from me, not from rumors or speculation." As if summoned by their conversation, Prince Alexander himself appeared at the door. Tall and distinguished in his military dress uniform, he carried himself with the confidence of a man ready to accept great responsibility. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his green eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Mother, I wanted to thank you again for this honor," he began, then stopped as he noticed the tension in the room. "Is everything all right?" Queen Isabella looked at her son, the young man she had raised with such love and care, and felt her heart break. "Alexander, please sit down. There's something we need to discuss." Prince Alexander's world collapsed in the space of a single conversation. As his mother explained the contents of the newly discovered documents, he listened with the stoic composure that had been drilled into him since childhood. But, behind his calm exterior, everything he had believed about himself and his future was crumbling. "So we're not." He began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You are my son in every way that matters," Queen Isabella said firmly, reaching across to take his hand. "These documents don't change the love I have for you or the pride I feel in the man you've become." "But they change everything else," Alexander replied quietly.
My entire life has been preparation for a throne that was never meant to be mine.
The weight of 32 years of training, expectations, and dreams pressed down upon him. Every lesson in statecraft, every diplomatic meeting, every moment spent learning to serve his people had been based on an assumption that was apparently false. Lord Chancellor Blackwood cleared his throat. Your Highness, we must consider our options carefully. These documents, while they appear authentic, have been hidden for decades. There may be ways to question their validity.
Alexander looked up sharply. You're suggesting we cover this up? Pretend we never found them?
I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities before making any irreversible decisions, Blackwood replied carefully. The stability of the kingdom must be our primary concern.
The stability of the kingdom is best served by legitimate rule, Alexander said firmly.
If Duke Ravencrest is the rightful king, then he should be informed of his heritage.
Queen Isabella felt a surge of pride at her son's response. Even facing the loss of everything he had worked toward, Alexander's first thought was of what was right rather than what was convenient. That's assuming Duke Ravencrest would even want the throne, Margaret pointed out. He's lived his entire life as a private citizen. The responsibility of ruling might be overwhelming.
Then, we give him the choice, the Queen decided. We cannot make decisions about his life without his knowledge or consent. The discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Princess Catherine, Alexander's younger sister, entered with her usual cheerful energy. At 28, she had always been the more carefree of the two royal children, preferring charity work and artistic pursuits to the heavy responsibilities of statecraft. The guests are getting restless, she announced, then noticed the somber atmosphere.
What's happened? You all look like someone died. Alexander stood and embraced his sister. Catherine, sit down. We have something important to tell you.
As the story was explained again, Catherine's reaction was markedly different from her brother's. Where Alexander had responded with stoic acceptance, Catherine became increasingly agitated.
This is ridiculous, she declared after hearing the full explanation. Some dusty old papers that conveniently appear on the day Alexander is supposed to be named heir?
This smells like a conspiracy to me.
The documents have been authenticated, Blackwood reminded her. By whom? And how do we know those experts haven't been bought off by our enemies?
Think about it, Valdoria has been prosperous and peaceful under Mother's rule. There are neighboring kingdoms that would love to see us destabilized. Her words gave everyone pause. Catherine, despite her reputation for being less politically minded than her brother, had raised a valid point. The timing of the discovery was certainly suspicious. Even if that were true, Queen Isabella said slowly, we cannot simply ignore what we've learned. If there's even a possibility that these documents are genuine, we have a moral obligation to investigate further.
And what about our obligation to our people? Catherine countered. They're expecting stability and continuity. If we suddenly announce that our entire royal line is illegitimate, it could cause panic, economic instability, even civil unrest.
Alexander had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. There's something else to consider, he said quietly. If news of this spreads before we can control the narrative, it could be even more damaging.
Rumors and speculation often cause more harm than the truth.
The Queen nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her son's words.
What are you suggesting?
We need to move carefully and quickly. First, we should postpone today's ceremony, cite a minor illness or administrative delay. Then, we need to locate Duke Ravencrest and speak with him privately. Only after we've had that conversation can we decide how to proceed.
And if he wants the throne? Catherine asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment.
Then, we help him prepare for it, just as you helped prepare me. The nobility and grace of his response silenced the room. Here was a young man who was potentially losing everything he had ever worked for, yet his primary concern remained the welfare of the kingdom and the rights of others. I'll make arrangements to travel to Duke Ravencrest's estate immediately, Blackwood said.
A small party, traveling discreetly, should be able to reach him by tomorrow evening.
No, Queen Isabella said firmly.
I will go myself. This news is too important and too delicate to be delivered by anyone else. Mother, that's too risky, Alexander protested.
If word gets out that you've left the capital suddenly, especially after postponing the ceremony, it could fuel dangerous speculation.
Then, we'll have to ensure word doesn't get out, the Queen replied. Margaret, can you arrange for a small, discreet traveling party?
We'll use the northern route through the mountain passes, fewer people, less chance of recognition.
As the plans began to take shape, each person in the room grappled with the magnitude of what they were contemplating.
They were not just dealing with a change in succession, they were potentially witnessing the end of one dynasty and the beginning of another. There's one more thing we need to consider, Catherine said reluctantly.
What if Duke Ravencrest doesn't want to be king, but the documents become public anyway? We could end up with neither a legitimate ruler nor a stable succession.
It was a chilling possibility.
If the documents were genuine but Ravencrest refused the throne, Valdoria could face a constitutional crisis unlike anything in its history.
We'll face the challenge if it comes, Queen Isabella decided.
But we cannot let fear of potential problems prevent us from doing what's right. As the afternoon wore on, the necessary arrangements were made.
The ceremony was postponed due to what was announced as a minor diplomatic complication requiring the Queen's immediate attention.
The explanation was vague enough to avoid suspicion while providing cover for the delay.
Prince Alexander found himself in the strange position of preparing for a journey that might end his claim to the throne forever. As he packed a small bag for the trip north, he reflected on the life he had lived and the future he had planned. Every decoration in his room, every book on his shelves, every uniform in his wardrobe represented years of preparation for a role he might never fulfill. Yet beneath the natural sadness and uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of relief. The burden of kingship was enormous, and, while he had accepted it willingly, he had never chosen it freely. Now, for the first time in his life, he might have the opportunity to discover who he really was beyond his royal title. Princess Catherine, meanwhile, was struggling with anger and disbelief. She had always looked up to her mother and brother, seeing them as pillars of strength and wisdom. The idea that their entire family identity might be based on a lie was almost impossible for her to accept. As evening fell and the preparations for the journey were finalized, the royal family gathered for what might be their last dinner together as the ruling dynasty of Valdoria. The meal was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts about what the next few days might bring.
Whatever happens, Queen Isabella said as they prepared to retire for the night, I want you both to know how proud I am of you. Your responses to this crisis have shown the true nobility of your characters. We learned from the best, Alexander replied, embracing his mother. No matter what these documents say about bloodlines, you will always be my queen and my mother. As they prepared to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever, none of them could have imagined the additional revelations that awaited them in the northern mountains, or the choices that would ultimately determine not just who would rule Valdoria, but what kind of kingdom it would become. The journey to Duke Marcus Ravencrest's estate took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in Valdoria. Queen Isabella, Prince Alexander, Lord Chancellor Blackwood, and a small security detail traveled in unmarked carriages through winding mountain passes where ancient pine forests stretched endlessly toward snow-capped peaks. The 2-day journey gave them ample time to contemplate the magnitude of their mission. Duke Ravencrest's estate, Thornwick Manor, sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and pristine lakes. The manor itself was a masterpiece of classical architecture, built from local stone and wood, with extensive gardens that reflected the Duke's passion for botany and literature. As their carriages approached the main house, they could see a figure working in one of the gardens, completely absorbed in tending to his plants. Marcus Ravencrest was not what any of them had expected. At 55, he was tall and lean, with silver-streaked brown hair and intelligent gray eyes. His hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with soil and books in equal measure. When he looked up at the approaching carriages, his expression showed curiosity rather than alarm, though he clearly recognized the royal insignia on the vehicles. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing respectfully as Queen Isabella descended from her carriage. "This is an unexpected honor. To what do I owe the pleasure of a royal visit to my humble estate?" His voice was cultured but unpretentious, carrying the accent of the northern provinces.
There was a warmth and intelligence in his manner that immediately put everyone at ease, despite the gravity of their mission.
Duke Ravencrest, the Queen replied, I'm afraid we come bearing news that will be difficult to hear. Might we speak privately? Of course, Your Majesty. Please, come inside.
The interior of Thornwick Manor reflected its owner's scholarly nature. The walls were lined with books in multiple languages, and comfortable reading chairs were positioned near tall windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding countryside. Artifacts from various cultures were displayed thoughtfully throughout the rooms, suggesting a mind that appreciated history and learning. As they settled in his private study, Duke Ravencrest offered refreshments and waited patiently for his guests to explain their visit. Queen Isabella found herself studying his features, looking for any resemblance to the late King Frederick or other members of the royal family. There were similarities, the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, but they were subtle enough to have gone unnoticed without this new context. Duke Ravencrest, the Queen began carefully, what I'm about to tell you may come as a shock. We've recently discovered documents that suggest your family history is quite different from what you've always believed. She proceeded to explain about the papers found in the royal archives, the evidence suggesting that his father was actually the late King Frederick, and the implications for the royal succession. Throughout her explanation, Duke Ravencrest listened with the patience and attention of a scholar, asking occasional clarifying questions but showing no dramatic emotional responses. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at his beloved gardens. May I see these documents? He asked finally. Lord Chancellor Blackwood produced copies of the most relevant papers, and Duke Ravencrest examined them with the careful eye of someone accustomed to historical research. He studied the handwriting, the seals, the paper quality, taking his time to process not just the content but the authenticity of what he was seeing. These appear genuine, he said eventually. The writing matches samples I've seen of correspondence from that era, and the details are too specific to be easily fabricated. He looked up at Queen Isabella with compassionate eyes. This must be devastating news for you, Your Majesty. His first concern being for her well-being, rather than his own potential claim to the throne, spoke volumes about his character. I'm more concerned about what it means for Valdoria, the Queen replied. If these documents are accurate, then you are the rightful king. Duke Ravencrest set down the papers and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Your Majesty, I've spent 55 years as a private citizen. I've devoted my life to learning, to my gardens, to quiet contemplation. I know nothing about ruling a kingdom. Knowledge can be learned, Prince Alexander spoke for the first time since entering the study. Wisdom and integrity cannot be taught, and you clearly possess both. The Duke turned to study the young prince. And what of you, Your Highness? You've prepared your entire life for the throne. How do you feel about potentially losing everything you've worked toward? Alexander met his gaze steadily. If the throne rightfully belongs to you, then that's where it should be. My personal disappointment is less important than the legitimacy of Valdoria's leadership. Duke Ravencrest nodded approvingly. Your mother has raised a man of exceptional character. He returned to his chair, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he had learned. There's something else you should know. My mother, before she died, sometimes made comments that seemed strange at the time. She would speak about roads not taken and secrets that died with the heart. I never understood what she meant. Perhaps she knew more than she revealed, Queen Isabella suggested. Perhaps. She was always protective of me, almost as if she feared something. He paused, then asked, what would happen if I refused this opportunity? If I chose to remain Duke Ravencrest rather than become King Marcus? Lord Chancellor Blackwood leaned forward. That would create a constitutional crisis. If the documents become public and you refuse the crown, there would be questions about the legitimacy of any subsequent ruler. And if I accept? Then, Valdoria would have its rightful king, but a king with no experience in governance during a time when the kingdom faces numerous challenges from neighboring nations and internal political pressures. The weight of the decision was enormous. Accept the throne and potentially destabilize the kingdom through inexperience. Refuse it and create a crisis of legitimacy that could tear the nation apart. I need time to think, Duke Ravencrest said finally.
This is not a decision I can make lightly.
Of course, Queen Isabella agreed.
But, I should warn you that we cannot keep this secret indefinitely.
There are already questions about why today's ceremony was postponed.
How long do we have?
Days, perhaps a week at most.
Duke Ravencrest nodded thoughtfully. Would it be possible for me to spend some time in the capital? To observe the court, to understand the daily realities of governance?
I cannot make an informed decision about my ability to rule without understanding what ruling actually entails. It was a wise request that impressed everyone present. Here was a man who approached even the most momentous decision of his life with the careful consideration of a scholar.
That can be arranged, Queen Isabella agreed.
You could stay at the palace as a guest, observing court proceedings and meeting with advisors.
And if I decide that I am capable of ruling, he asked.
Then, we would arrange for a smooth transition of power, ensuring that the kingdom's stability is maintained throughout the process.
And if I decide that I am not? This was the question that had no good answer.
They all understood that once this knowledge existed, it could not be unknown.
Even if Duke Ravencrest refused the throne, the shadow of illegitimacy would hang over any future ruler.
Then, we would find a way to move forward that serves the best interests of Valdoria, the Queen said carefully. As the evening progressed, they continued their discussions, with Duke Ravencrest asking detailed questions about everything from foreign policy to domestic economics. His inquiries revealed a sharp mind and a genuine concern for the welfare of the people. Prince Alexander found himself impressed by the man's thoughtful approach and wondered if perhaps Valdoria might actually benefit from having such a reflective leader. The next morning, Duke Ravencrest made his decision about the immediate future. I will come with you to the capital, he announced. I need to understand what I would be accepting or refusing. As they prepared for the journey back to the palace, each person was lost in their own thoughts. Queen Isabella wondered if she was doing the right thing by potentially giving up a throne she had held for 30 years. Prince Alexander contemplated a future that was suddenly uncertain but potentially liberating. Duke Ravencrest faced the possibility of trading his peaceful, scholarly life for the immense responsibilities of kingship. None of them could have predicted that their return to the capital would coincide with a crisis that would test not only Duke Ravencrest's potential for leadership but also force all of them to confront what it truly means to serve one's people. The royal party's return to the capital coincided with troubling news that would test everyone's resolve and judgment. As their carriages approached the palace gates, they were met by Princess Catherine and several royal advisors, their faces grave with concern. "Mother, thank goodness you've returned," Catherine said urgently as Queen Isabella descended from her carriage. "We've received intelligence reports of a potential uprising in the eastern provinces. Lord General Harrison is requesting immediate military consultation." The timing could not have been worse. Just as they were grappling with questions of royal legitimacy, external forces threatened to destabilize the kingdom further. Duke Ravencrest, who had spent the journey back observing the landscape and asking thoughtful questions about regional governance, now found himself thrust immediately into a crisis situation. "What kind of uprising?" Prince Alexander asked, his military training immediately engaged. "Separatist movements in 3 eastern provinces," replied General Harrison, who had arrived at the palace as soon as he learned of the royal party's return. "They're claiming that recent tax increases have been unfairly imposed without proper provincial representation. There are reports of armed gatherings and threats against royal tax collectors." Queen Isabella processed this information with the calm efficiency of 3 decades of rule. "What are our military capabilities in those regions?" "Limited, Your Majesty. We have garrison forces, but they're insufficient to handle a coordinated uprising across multiple provinces. We would need to deploy troops from the capital or western regions." Duke Ravencrest listened to this exchange with intense focus. This was not theoretical governance, this was real crisis management with potentially severe consequences for thousands of people. He could see the strain on Queen Isabella's face as she weighed military options against diplomatic solutions. "Before we discuss troop deployments," he interjected quietly, "might I ask about the nature of these tax increases?"
What prompted them, and were the provincial governors consulted during the decision-making process? His questions surprised everyone.
Most people, when faced with news of armed rebellion, would focus on military responses.
Duke Ravencrest's first instinct was to understand the root causes of the conflict.
Lord Chancellor Blackwood answered, the taxes were increased to fund infrastructure improvements and military modernization. The decision was made by the Royal Council after extensive economic analysis.
But, were the affected provinces included in these discussions? Duke Ravencrest pressed.
There was a telling pause before Blackwood replied. The provincial representatives were informed of the decision after it was finalized.
Duke Ravencrest nodded thoughtfully.
So they were told about new taxes but not consulted about the need for them or given alternatives to consider. The efficiency of governance sometimes requires decisive action, General Harrison said, slightly defensive about the implied criticism. True, Duke Ravencrest agreed, but legitimacy often requires consultation. If people understand the reasoning behind difficult decisions and feel their voices have been heard, they're more likely to accept hardship.
Prince Alexander found himself impressed by this analysis.
In his military experience, he had learned that soldiers fought more effectively when they understood their mission.
Perhaps the same principle applied to civilian governance. What would you suggest? Queen Isabella asked Duke Ravencrest directly.
Before deploying troops, perhaps we could send envoys to meet with the provincial leaders. If we can understand their specific grievances and demonstrate willingness to address legitimate concerns, we might resolve this through negotiation rather than force.
General Harrison shook his head.
Your Majesty, with respect to the Duke, these separatists have already resorted to armed gathering. They've moved beyond the point where diplomacy can be effective.
Have they actually attacked anyone? Duke Ravencrest asked. Well, no.
But the threat of violence is implicit in their actions. Then, perhaps the threat is a desperate attempt to be heard rather than a genuine desire for conflict.
The debate continued throughout the afternoon, with Duke Ravencrest consistently advocating for diplomatic solutions while military advisors pressed for shows of force. Queen Isabella found herself caught between these approaches, recognizing wisdom in both perspectives. As evening approached, she called for a private meeting with Duke Ravencrest, Prince Alexander, and Princess Catherine.
I want your honest assessment, she said once they were alone.
How do you think we should proceed?
Duke Ravencrest was quiet for a moment, then spoke thoughtfully. Your Majesty, I've spent one day observing your court, and I'm already seeing patterns that concern me.
Every solution proposed today has been either complete capitulation to demands or overwhelming shows of force. No one has suggested the middle path of genuine engagement. The middle path takes time we may not have, Catherine pointed out.
Perhaps. But, consider this, if we respond to these grievances with military force, we may win this immediate conflict but create lasting resentment that will fuel future rebellions. If we capitulate completely, we may encourage other provinces to use threats as a negotiating tool.
Prince Alexander leaned forward. What would genuine engagement look like?
Send representatives who have the authority to negotiate, not just to deliver ultimatums. Listen to the specific concerns of each province and work to address them within the framework of national needs. Demonstrate that the Crown values provincial input while maintaining the unity of the kingdom.
Queen Isabella studied Duke Ravencrest carefully.
You speak as if you have experience with such negotiations.
I've mediated disputes between neighboring estates for years, he replied. The principles are similar, though obviously the scale is much larger.
Over the next 2 days, Duke Ravencrest's approach was put to the test. A delegation was sent to the eastern provinces with authority to negotiate directly with provincial leaders. Rather than demanding immediate compliance or threatening military action, the envoys were instructed to listen to concerns and explore solutions. The results were remarkable. The provincial leaders, surprised by the Crown's willingness to engage seriously with their grievances, proved much more reasonable than expected. They had specific concerns about how the tax increases would affect struggling farmers and small merchants, and they had practical suggestions for alternative approaches that could achieve the Crown's revenue goals while minimizing local hardship. Within a week, agreements were reached that satisfied both the kingdom's financial needs and the province's concerns about fairness and representation. The threatened uprising dissolved as provincial leaders returned to their communities with evidence that their voices had been heard and their concerns addressed.
How did you know that would work? Prince Alexander asked Duke Ravencrest as they reviewed reports of the successful negotiations.
I didn't know it would work, Duke Ravencrest admitted. But I believed it was worth trying because the alternative, ruling through force and fear, ultimately weakens any kingdom. Queen Isabella had observed Duke Ravencrest throughout this crisis, and what she saw both impressed and troubled her. He had demonstrated wisdom, judgment, and a natural instinct for leadership that suggested he could indeed be an effective ruler. But this also made her decision more difficult. You've proven yourself capable of making the kinds of decisions a king must make, she told him that evening as they walked through the palace gardens.
The question now is whether you want that responsibility.
Duke Ravencrest was quiet for a long time, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors.
I've been thinking about legacy, he said finally.
You've ruled for 30 years, bringing peace and prosperity to Valdoria.
Prince Alexander has prepared his entire life to continue that legacy.
If I take the throne, I disrupt all of that for what might be nothing more than a technicality of bloodlines. It's not a technicality if you're the rightful king, Queen Isabella replied.
But what makes someone rightful? Is it blood? Is it preparation? Is it the acceptance of the people? Is it the ability to serve effectively?
He turned to face her.
I've come to believe that legitimacy isn't just about who your parents were.
It's about earning the trust and respect of those you serve. His words carried a wisdom that impressed the queen, but they also highlighted the complexity of their situation. In the days that followed, Duke Ravencrest would need to make his final decision, and that choice would reshape not only his own life but the future of the entire kingdom. The final decision came not through dramatic revelation or political maneuvering, but through a quiet conversation in the palace library where Duke Ravencrest had spent much of his week reading about Valdorian history and law.
Queen Isabella found him there late one evening, surrounded by ancient texts about royal succession and constitutional principles.
I've been researching the legal foundations of monarchy, he said without looking up from a particularly old volume.
It's fascinating how much our system has evolved over the centuries.
Queen Isabella sat down across from him, noting the careful way he handled the ancient books.
And what have you concluded?
Duke Ravencrest closed the book he had been reading and looked at her directly.
I've concluded that legitimacy is more complex than bloodlines or legal documents.
A king's right to rule comes not from who his father was, but from his ability to serve his people effectively and justly.
That sounds like the beginning of a decision.
It is. He stood and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the capital city, where thousands of lights twinkled in the darkness.
Your Majesty, you have been a remarkable queen.
Your reign has brought prosperity, peace, and justice to Valdoria.
Prince Alexander has spent his life preparing to continue that legacy. Princess Catherine brings fresh perspectives and genuine care for the people. Together, you represent 30 years of accumulated wisdom and experience.
He turned back to face her. I represent a legal claim based on documents that were hidden away and forgotten for decades. To disrupt your dynasty for the sake of that claim would not serve the best interests of Valdoria.
Queen Isabella felt a mixture of relief and admiration. You're refusing the crown? Not exactly.
Duke Ravencrest returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful.
I'm proposing something different. Something that might serve both legitimacy and stability. He outlined his proposal carefully.
Rather than a complete transfer of power or a complete rejection of his claim, he suggested a formal acknowledgement of the historical truth combined with a practical solution for the future. He would be officially recognized as the heir of King Frederick, but would formally renounce his claim to the throne in favor of Queen Isabella's continued reign, with Prince Alexander as her designated successor. This would satisfy the legal requirements for legitimate succession while preserving the stability and continuity that Valdoria needs, he explained. The truth would be acknowledged, but the kingdom's best interests would be served.
Queen Isabella considered this proposal carefully. "And what would your role be in this arrangement?"
"I would return to my estate and continue my quiet life, perhaps with a more formal role as an advisor on provincial matters when needed. The recent crisis in the eastern provinces has shown me that I might be able to contribute to the kingdom's welfare without needing to rule it."
The wisdom and selflessness of this proposal impressed everyone who heard it.
Duke Ravencrest was offering to give up the highest position in the land in order to serve what he believed were the best interests of the people. It was a decision that demonstrated the very qualities that might have made him an excellent king.
Prince Alexander, when informed of the proposal, was initially resistant.
"You're the rightful king," he insisted.
"I cannot accept a crown that legally belongs to you."
"You can and you should," Duke Ravencrest replied firmly.
"Because accepting that crown means accepting the responsibility to serve Valdoria above your own interests. That's exactly what I'm doing by offering it to you." The formal ceremony that followed was unlike anything in Valdorian history.
Duke Ravencrest was officially recognized as the legitimate son of King Frederick, with all the honors due to a member of the royal family. However, in the same ceremony, he formally renounced his claim to succession, declaring that the throne should remain with Queen Isabella and pass to Prince Alexander.
The public response was extraordinary.
Rather than seeing this as a sign of weakness or illegitimacy, the people of Valdoria viewed it as a demonstration of the nobility and wisdom of their leadership. Here was a man who had discovered he could be king but chose instead to support what he believed was best for the kingdom. Duke Ravencrest's speech during the ceremony became one of the most quoted in Valdorian history. "True nobility is not found in the accident of birth, but in the choice to serve others above oneself. Today, I choose to serve Valdoria by ensuring that its throne remains with those best equipped to guide its future." Queen Isabella's reign continued for another 5 years, during which time Duke Ravencrest became an unofficial advisor on matters requiring delicate negotiation and provincial relations. His success in resolving the Eastern Province crisis had established his reputation as a skilled mediator, and he found fulfillment in this role that he might never have discovered as king.
Prince Alexander's eventual coronation was strengthened rather than weakened by these events.
He had proven his nobility by being willing to give up the throne for the sake of legitimacy, and he had gained valuable experience by working closely with both his mother and Duke Ravencrest during his extended preparation period. Princess Catherine found her own role in these events, becoming the kingdom's first official ambassador for provincial relations, working closely with Duke Ravencrest to ensure that local concerns were heard and addressed at the highest levels of government. The documents that had threatened to tear the kingdom apart instead became the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to serve. The crisis had revealed not the weakness of Valdoria's institutions, but their strength.
When faced with questions of legitimacy and rightful rule, the kingdom's leaders had chosen wisdom over expedience, service over self-interest, and the welfare of the people over personal ambition.
Years later, historians would write about this period as a defining moment in Valdoria's development as a nation. The peaceful resolution of what could have been a devastating succession crisis demonstrated the maturity of the kingdom's political culture and the character of its leaders. Duke Ravencrest returned to his beloved Thornwick Manor, where he continued his scholarly pursuits and his gardens. But his life had been enriched by his brief time at court and his ongoing role as an advisor. He had discovered that service to others came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest service was knowing when not to lead. Queen Isabella's legacy was secured not just by her 30 years of effective rule, but by her handling of this crisis. She had shown that true leadership sometimes meant being willing to give up power for the sake of truth and justice, even when that truth challenged the very foundation of her authority. And Prince Alexander, when he finally became King Alexander I, ruled with a deep understanding that leadership was not a birthright to be claimed, but a responsibility to be earned anew each day through service to his people. The Kingdom of Valdoria emerged from this crisis stronger and more united than ever before, having learned that legitimacy came not from the circumstances of one's birth, but from the choices one made in service to others. The crown that had seemed destined to tear them apart had instead become the symbol of their commitment to wisdom, justice, and the welfare of all their people. In the end, the greatest victory was not in determining who should rule, but in discovering what it truly meant to serve.